Hi everyone, my name is Leo Hickman. I'm the editor of Carbon Brief, and welcome to today's webinar. Kind of almost like an emergency webinar because of the events that have gone on this week. And obviously we're here to talk about the implications of Donald Trump's victory in Tuesday's US election and what that could mean for climate action internationally. Obviously, we're just on the eve of COP29 in Baku, but also possibly we'll get into the topic of what that means domestically and kind of regionally for climate and related policies, energy policy, etc. And I'm really, really delighted to have a fantastic panel to discuss this. We've got about an hour. And I'm not too sure which way around the screen you can all see this, but I'll go through everyone in turn just to sort of say hello and sort of introduce everyone. But first of all, I've got Camilla Born, who's an independent climate advisor, and particularly for this discussion, was a former senior official and advisor for the COP26 summit in Glasgow. So hi, Camilla. And then we've also got Shuo, who's joining us. I think I maybe in Baku now or in the US still. I'm not too sure. We'll find out. But it's the director of the China Climate Hub at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And then someone who I do know has just arrived in Baku is Mohamed Adow, the founding director of Power Shift Africa. And I think, Mohamed, you've literally just arrived in Baku in the last hour. And then finally, my colleague, Dr. Simon Evans, who's the deputy editor of Carbon Brief and our senior policy editor. So we've got lots and lots of fantastic questions coming in. We've got a colleague behind the scenes, Molly, who's kind of going through the questions. So if you can use the I think it's the Q&A box down at the bottom, you can post questions and we'll try and get through to those and field those to the panelists. But I think let's just kick off with what we think the implications of Donald Trump's victory might mean for COP29, given it starts formally on Monday, I think, in Baku. And we've sort of, to some degree, had this situation before, right? I and probably all of us on this call can remember being in Marrakesh in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected first time round, and the huge ramification and impact that immediately had on that COP dynamic. But maybe if I can start with Camilla, can you just give us a sense of what right now, here we are right now, just a few days away from COP29, what signal, what impact, material impacts this could have on the COP29 process?
Sure, happy to. So the first thing to say is everyone's been planning, everyone's done their scenario planning, so everyone will be more or less ready to go, although reality is always hits harder than perhaps you expect it will be. But they will be running their plans. The thing that was really actually bizarrely helpful about the COP coming at the same time as the US election last time around in Marrakesh was that it forced countries to clarify their positioning vis-a-vis a US president who was, an incoming US president who was saying we're going to push back against climate. So I think, again, we'll have that clarifying moment, and seeing which countries show up with which approach will be front and center, and a really helpful moment to scrutinize that. We'll also see a US team that, yes, will be lame duck in many ways, but we know their fearsome legal expertise, and they will be working around the clock to ensure that whatever is agreed, particularly on the long-term finance goal, is something that they can be part of in the future. And so we won't have the flexibility and wiggle room that you could imagine that you might have if you didn't have the US ever as part of the UNFCCC, because they will be ensuring that there is an opportunity to return. So I think this election, for me, the biggest hit that this has is on confidence, and confidence in climate action. Absolutely, if you're already deeply invested, which we see for most advanced economies, you're going to keep on keeping on, although it might shake some markets temporarily, it might shake some industry temporarily. But for those who are a little bit more on the fence, it's going to be trickier. And I think we'll see some of those wobbles through the beginnings of COP and through the couple of weeks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Camilla. Mohamed, if I can come to you next, I'm interested to get your thoughts on how the Trump win might impact directly onto COP29. I'm also particularly thinking around the very, very deep and kind of complex discussions around the new finance goal and whether, in the COP29 right now, but obviously casting forward, what you think that impact could be.
I think first thing first, I think there are many drivers of climate action beyond the White House. The economics of clean energy and the growing concern among the public, and particularly young people, which we've seen in poll after poll, and the upcoming, new strengthened nationally determined contributions that we expect from countries are the kind of drivers that we should be looking at and that should be giving us confidence. I don't think the rest of the world is going to let Donald Trump and his administration to hold hostage all these important other actions that are happening across the world. Of course, the US election reminds the rest of the world that if we want to save ourselves, we can't wait around anymore. We need to get our act together, and all action that is needed to mitigate any damage that is caused by the Trump administration and his fossil fuel backers needs to actually be shown in Baku. We have an excellent opportunity in Baku. And if we took a long-term view, I don't think the election that we've had in the US is going to affect, the process to set, a needs-based, collective long-term goals to mobilize, the trillions that are needed to help actually tackle climate change. And so there is a risk, of course, that in the absence of the US, other countries will not come forward and provide the kind of assurances developing countries are looking for. But I must say that, even with a Democrat in the White House, we haven't seen the US stepping forward and providing much solidarity, particularly for the climate vulnerable countries, by way of climate finance. So on that count, I don't think much has changed. But the challenge now is for the rest of the world, and particularly Europe, and Japan, Australia, Canada, whether they can actually step forward and provide the much needed confidence that the rest of the developing countries are looking for. And I think that is the opportunity in our multipolar world, the opportunity for others to now step in and provide that much needed confidence. Why I say this is because if you look at the risk associated with relying on the White House to save the planet, I think we'll be in a real trouble if that's how we looked at our planet and only look to the White House to actually save us. We have not even been doing that, with the last Democratic administration. So we're not going to panic in Baku. And I think because we now have a change of occupancy in the White House, all of a sudden we think we've lost everything. But we need to take the risk seriously and tackle them. And so the opportunity for a coalition to emerge of the willing that will actually help fill that void and provide the much needed assurances, particularly in delivering the much needed climate finance goal, I think is something we need to see out of Baku.
Okay, many thanks, Mohamed. Sure, if I can turn to you next. Thanks for joining us. At every COP, right, all eyes are often on China. There's obviously a deep interest and fascination with how China approaches any COP. But with this Donald Trump victory, what's your assessment on what this could? How is the Chinese government? How are the Chinese going to approach this COP? And maybe more longer term, is this arguably even a geopolitical opportunity for China in terms of some of the things that Mohamed just spoke about being a kind of coalition sort of railing against the direction that the new White House might be?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Leo. Let me just begin by just underlining really the significance of the moment that we're in. We are, of course, not dealing with the good news, not a good climate news. I think really in many ways, COP29 in Baku will be one of the earliest tests of the global commitment to climate multilateralism, to Paris Agreement. And I think there's a need really for a clear and strong signal from the rest of the world at the beginning of a COP to reaffirm their previously made commitments. I think the other immediate impact of the US election outcome is COP29, in addition to being the place to resolve the highly controversial climate finance issue, will also become an early platform for the global climate community to get together and to strategize on what should happen next, right? And in many ways, I agree with Camilla. The international climate community has been preparing for this moment. So a lot of the preparation now needs to accelerate. And if we are able to do so, then COP29 will actually be, I think, a good opportunity to reunite the global community, to start to address some of the divisions and the cracks that we began to see over recent years in the multilateral climate regime. Again, on COP29, look, Trump's election victory is not good news for the climate finance issue. I think it will make deal making more difficult. I think we need to be prepared for some turbulence. But I'm still confident that by the end of Baku, we will have a deal. The EU and China will be two very important players for deal making. I would say, when you look at China, a few things. One is I hope the country understands the historical weight of this COP. The fact that really the rest of the world is looking very carefully. I'm seeing almost 1,000 people on this call, right? I hope China understands that, and the optics, the way that they agree and make compromise with other countries will matter a great deal. Will send a very strong signal. Will be the basis for the rest of the world to judge the future of global climate governance, which China has invested a lot in over the last decade. The second thing I would say is when it comes to the US-China front, as many of you know, the two countries have been taking very extensive climate consultations under the Biden administration. I see a great need for a lot of those conversations to be moved to the subnational level through non-state actors, and also through various track 1.5 and track 2 dialogues. The last thing that I would say is, and this is really where the US election doesn't have any impact at all on China's trajectory, which is, in addition to the usual kind of domestic climate politics in China, UNFCCC politics, we need to realize there is a larger story happening at the background, which is the global green economic transformation, very much led by the robust, strong development of China's clean tech industry. And this is very much happening just based on economic 101 logics. That logic will not be changed by the US election outcome. So I would expect China to progress further on the green economy track, and will play in the near future an even larger role when it comes to helping other countries to decarbonize. Let me maybe just leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Shuo. Simon, if I can come to you, back in maybe looking a bit more at the domestic impact in the US. We can keep talking about COP29 and the UNFCCC, etc. But if just looking at the domestic sense, back in March, you undertook some analysis for us at Carbon Brief, and it has been suddenly reared up again this week and has been cited all over the world again. And do you want to just talk us through that? Because you were kind of comparing the difference between a continuation of a Trump/Harris White House over the next 4 years versus if Donald Trump did get elected, and he has got elected. Can you just talk us through some of your findings and what that showed?
Yeah, thanks, Leo. As you mentioned, I worked closely with Werner, our data scientist, back at the start of this year to look at the potential impact on US emissions if Trump was re-elected, as he has been. And obviously, no one really knows, that there's quite a lot that's been said by Trump and other people that have been part of his campaign about what a second Trump administration would do in terms of rolling back, climate laws, drill baby drill, and all of that. But a lot of, there was actually quite a great deal of uncertainty. So what we did was we looked at a scenario, a kind of Democrat administration scenario where the Inflation Reduction Act passed under Biden and a series of key federal kind of climate rules under the EPA in terms of car emissions and methane from oil and gas drilling and so on. We looked at what would happen if those regulations continued, and then we compared that to a scenario where those things all got repealed in full. Now, obviously, there's quite a lot of debate, and particularly now that Trump has been re-elected, about the extent to which Trump can or will be able to completely roll back all of those regulations, and whether the fact that the IRA has brought, is already a lot of tax credits have kind of been racked up, and a lot of the benefits have gone to red states. So there's a question mark about how realistic that scenario is, but nevertheless, that was kind of what we had to work with. And just in terms of like the headline findings, we found that the difference between that kind of continuation status quo Democrat scenario versus a Trump scenario was something like 4 billion tons of CO2 emissions out to 2030 cumulatively. And obviously 4 billion tons is quite hard to get your head around but it definitively is a lot of emissions. And I think that we worked out it was something like all of the clean energy installed worldwide over the past 5 years, the climate benefit of all of that, all of that progress that's happened was about 4 billion tons. So it would wipe that out if Trump's able to dismantle Biden's legacy in that way. I guess what we didn't really look at, because there wasn't any sort of firm handle to get on it, was this kind of Project 2025 stuff. What happens if, for example, if Trump permits loads of new LNG export terminals, if he opens up federal lands for more drilling, if he's able to, do other things beyond just repealing the stuff that Biden brought in to actively promote the use and extraction of fossil fuels in the US, and that would obviously increase emissions in the US even further beyond what we thought. And equally, it might not be quite that bad if some of the ideas built into the IRA that were designed to prevent it being rolled back or make it harder to roll back, if those are effective.
Thanks, Simon. There's a question very related to that, which has had a lot of upvotes already, which is from Tom Abram, which is, do we know how much of the US's Inflation Reduction Act has been allocated at this point, and how much could be allocated in the next, slightly desperate scramble, I guess, into before the end of January? Do you have a sense of that?
I don't have a sense of the numbers on that. What I know that because it's a law that's been passed, so Congress has kind of allocated a bunch of money, or a bunch, has put these tax credits in play. And I think there's a bit of a question mark about the extent to which Trump, as the president, can kind of say, actually, this money that Congress has already agreed to spend, we're not going to spend it. So I think there is a question mark over that aspect of whether he can withhold money that Congress has already put on the table, if you like.
Okay, thanks, Simon. There's a question which I think everyone is going to be able to speak to this to some degree, but Camilla, I'd like to get your thoughts on it first, which is come in from Paul Chandler, which is this big, wide open question, but I think there's a kind of legal answer to this as well, is can the Paris Agreement survive Trump's next presidency? Maybe, Camilla, you can just say what happened for the first Trump presidency in terms of him, signaling on I think it was in the Rose Garden in the summer of 2017, kind of saying, we're going to pull out of Paris. But I don't think that actually happened for a few years. But what happens now? And then the sister question to that, really, which is, could the new White House pull the US completely out of the convention from the early 90s? Maybe, Camilla, first, you can have a go at that.
Yeah, and I will also paste in the chat a helpful briefing that the UNFCCC did if you want to look at the kind of legal expertise behind it. So first time around, the way the Paris Agreement had been configured meant that no one could leave after ratifying for 2 years. And that meant the Trump administration first time around had to wait 2 years to then put in their notice, and then it took a year for them to leave. They left the Paris Agreement as opposed to the UN Framework Convention. This time around, they could choose to do that again. They don't have to wait that 2 years. They can just put in that 1 year notice, and then they would be out within a year. Alternatively, they can notify the Secretary General that they're pulling out of the UNFCCC itself, so the Framework Convention, and then of course they wouldn't be party to the Paris Agreement. As I said, the US are, phenomenal lawyers, and they have been all over this. So they have, ensured that there are all the kind of checks and balances in there. So if the US was to withdraw, there is a space for them to come back in. I also think the fact that there is a very vibrant US civil society that's involved in the international space will also help safeguard and create an environment where a US could re-enter. So I would see it as a temporary thing if they do decide to withdraw, as opposed to a long-lasting component. And there's a lot of people who've been working closely with that set of expertise, and so would also want to ensure that the door is open. There are obviously some downsides to that, because in some ways you could have a more dynamic UN Framework Convention discussion perhaps, and do some slightly different things if you weren't constrained by some of the US dynamics. But then, as one of the world's largest emitters, I think it wouldn't be the most sound conclusion to come to not put that there. In terms of will the Paris Agreement survive? I mean, absolutely. I think Shuo was right on the money when he's talking about the fact that this time around, it's not just equities of climate change is a nice thing to take action on, and it's morally the right thing to do, whilst, that should remain important. But it is also the fact that money is invested, people have jobs in this space. This is a whole range of different interests that are around the economic transformation that comes from that organizing principle of net zero. And that's not going to go away. Of course, not having a confident US voice pushing it forward on the global stage isn't helpful. It's a real shame. But those economics still stand. And we have the world's largest emitter betting most heavily on this transition, both politically and economically, in the shape of China. And China wants to export what it is producing in terms of its clean tech. And so they will want partners who want their exports. And so that force is going to shape things in a different way as well.
Okay, thanks, Camilla. Sure. Responding to that point, I think both you and Mohamed have already sort of talked about the issue or the potential of China and others forming a kind of an opposition coalition almost if the US would pull out. We've had a question from Suraya Patel saying, do you think that the US is declining in its influence across international relations, potentially with obviously a new Trump presidency? And what role does one anticipate with regards to the increasing influence of the BRICS countries, which obviously there was a BRICS meeting recently? Maybe, sure, you can speak to this first, and then we'll move on to Mohamed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I mean, if the US is going to withdraw again from the Paris Agreement or even the Framework Convention, then of course it will immediately lose its international influence when it comes to the future of global climate rulemaking. And so basically, the US is doing this at its own expense. I would also say again, one of the implications of Trump's election is, at least for the next few years, the biggest and the most important driver for global climate action becomes not politics, global politics, where UNFCCC, kind of the narrow UNFCCC world familiar politics, global north versus global south, common but differentiated responsibilities, and so on and so forth. The biggest and most important driver becomes the green economy. Who is winning that race in the world? There, China has a head start, a very significant one, right? When the wind and solar industry, for example, gets started in China in the early 2010s, we are now looking at a country that has been doing this for almost 15 years. And while doing so, of course, managed to reduce significantly the cost of renewable energy and clean technologies. And really, benefiting the rest of the world and their decarbonization forces. The U.S. most recently has realized that they're lagging behind and are trying to catch up with the IRA And now with 4 years Trump administration, we can make our own judgment on where the U.S. will be in a few years. That's I think the other way of saying, indeed, on the economic front, the U.S. risks losing this race. We're being lagged behind even further.
Thank you. Just quick, before I just dive over to Mohamed, I just want to there's a question that's coming from Belinda Shep relating to the EU and China's relationship now. I think you've already alluded to this, probably the increasing importance of that twin relationship between. Can you just speak to that? And then I want to move over to Mohamed to answer this wider point as well.
Sure. So from the very near term, as I said, the EU and China's role will be very important for COP29. The optics, right? The way that they work together, the journey toward the NCQG deal with hopefully joint leadership from both the EU and China. I think that will, give us a starting point for hopefully a stronger alignment or realignment between these two biggest economies and emitters in the world. Going into 2025, I think it's very important for both sides to consider whether and how they want to structure their exchanges and engagement on the critical issue of nationally determined contributions. Both sides are expected to announce their NDC next year. And on top of that, colleagues may recall when Trump was elected for the first time, the EU and China were two of the three critical partners to establish a diplomatic framework or platform called MOCA, Ministerial on Climate Action, to continue to drive global climate discussions. Will the two countries kind of get back to this platform, how they want to reform this platform, and how they want to drive and provide a leadership role, right, in future global climate conversations. I think that's also a very important issue for both sides to consider. And last but not least, we need to realize, of course, the EU and China, when it comes to their political relationship, are not where they were a few years ago. There are more tensions, more disputes between the two sides, including on climate and decarbonization. Of course, the donor-based issue, but also the green trade disputes between these two sides. So I would have to imagine, as part of the EU-China realignment, if the two sides can pull this together, there needs to be a component to talk about and to hopefully also realign on the trade issue. That will also become a very important component in the overall bilateral conversation.
Oops, sorry. Mohamed, on this, we've heard from Shuo about the potential leadership role that China will now step into with the US pulling back and the EU-China dynamic. Can you give a sense within these kind of coalitions that need to come together now to sort of take the Paris Agreement and the energy transition, all of this forward? Can you maybe speak to the likely response of some of the most climate vulnerable nations around the world, particularly across the global south? We've seen these kind of coalitions forming before, and certain blocs and certain parties coming together within these dynamics. What's your sense of how this is going to play out?
Okay, I think the rest of the world, I don't think will just stand by and let Trump's ignorance ruin the planet that we all share. And so what we should expect starting here in Baku is for the rest of the world to band together and to be able to actually demonstrate that we're moving forward with or without Trump's administration. What will happen, I think, is if we were to actually look at the impact of Trump's decision, whatever decision he makes, because there is a risk here that Trump does what he did last time, which is to withdraw the US from the global agreement. But the actual impact of that will be the impact it will have on the US place in the clean energy transition and in this race that we've seen China winning. And that would be a huge loss to only the American people. Because what you will have is other powers will emerge and step in and lead in the global clean energy technology development, which we already seen with China. But the bigger risk, and I think this is where the rest of the world will also be affected. US is currently the biggest, historic polluter, and has emerged as the biggest oil and gas producer. And so that will have a huge impact on the delivery of the global commitment to hold global heating to below 1.5 degrees. Without the US and the US contributing to the global effort, I think the opportunity to actually secure the 1.5 guardrail is going to be threatened. But the rest of the world, including climate vulnerable countries, are already leading the way in building, resilience and addressing, climate impacts. And that part, I think, will continue. What will not be sufficiently be delivered, and I think this is important, is the scale of finance that the rest of the world expects from the developed world, and particularly from the US. If we're going to genuinely be able to contribute sufficient action to help hold warming to below 1.5 degrees, we needed the highest historic emitter and the wealthiest country in the world contributing its fair share. Ultimately, no one can run from the climate crisis, not even Donald Trump. The whole world is facing extreme weather events, economies and livelihoods are being wrecked. And so if we're going to deliver solutions at the scale that science demands, I think we have to look at what needs to be happening in the US at the subnational level. I think in the earlier conversation, the question of IRA was raised. And I think it's important for us to recognize from what we've heard from our allies in the US is that even with Trump's administration, the massive levels of tax credits on clean energy that IRA has actually resulted in are already baked into the US law. And there are a number of Republicans, Congress members who have actually already gone on record to oppose, cuts to clean energy tax credits. And there is also at the subnational level, I think states and local governments that are already acting ambitiously on climate. And I think this is something we need to sustain so that even without, the federal government contributing, I think as much action that can be delivered through subnational level can actually be sustained. One thing is certain, that is not going to be enough, but those actions are substantial and we need to continue sustaining them. Where does this put the rest of the world in relation to the US? I think that's a bigger question. I think this will erode trust in the US in a way that US role in other multilateral processes will actually be affected. So one man's ignorance is also going to usually shift the geopolitics, not just on climate, but on a number of foreign issues in a way that when US basically walks away from the Paris Agreement and fails to honor their climate finance commitments, that will significantly erode, any trust in the US in a way that they can be seen as a reliable ally by anyone else on any other issue. And that will actually affect a number of other critical issues that the world is grappling with.
Thank you, Mohamed. Simon, sort of maybe continuing on that theme of some subnational trends and sectorial trends, the International Energy Agency recently put out its latest World Energy Outlook. And I'm wondering how some of the scenarios and visions within that, let's say, and other organizations looking ahead to some of the, which we've already heard today on this call, some of the perhaps irresistible or unstoppable trends that are going on around the world. Can you give us a sense? Because we've had questions such as, there's one that's coming from Anthony Lamb about, with Elon Musk's involvement with the US administration, what could that mean for EVs? Obviously, he's got somewhat of a vested interest in that, but are there some areas where you can, and where some of the forecasters and modelers are just assuming that actually even a Donald Trump in the White House can't really knock things off course?
Yeah, thanks, Leo. So just coming, I just want to quickly come back to the 1.5 question that Mohammed already touched on. In its latest emissions gap report, the UN Environment Programme said that unless emissions in 2030 were brought below the levels implied by current climate pledges, then a pathway to 1.5 was effectively impossible. And that would also strongly increase the chances of staying below 2 degrees. So in our analysis that we did of the implications of a Trump win in the election, we basically said that that kind of effectively ended global hopes of staying below 1.5 degrees, and that's the reasoning why. Because in order to stay below 1.5 degrees, we need a lot of progress before 2030. And obviously, regardless of what happens outside of the US, the US is such a big part of the picture, and obviously also the biggest historical contributor to climate change, that it's quite hard to see the 1.5 target being met with Trump in office. That said, I think we've had some questions, and I've seen quite a lot of reactions this week along the lines of, well, 1.5 was lost with a Harris presidency as well. So what's the difference? Quite nihilistic kind of take on the situation. And so I think it's worth saying that all of the things that we've been talking about today, all of the ways in which progress will continue, they do make a difference. Even if the world doesn't limit warming to 1.5 degrees, every fraction of a degree matters. Every ton of CO2 does count, and every year of delay in the US or in other parts of the world does make it harder to avoid escalating climate impacts. Coming back to your question about what's the trends, what can Trump do and not do. I mean, I guess it's worth reflecting on what he said in his first presidency, his first term in office, where he came in on a big promises about boosting the coal industry, saving jobs in the coal mining and so on. And I think I saw a figure that coal dropped by something like 38% in Trump's first term, which was about the same as it had dropped in the previous term under President Obama. And so I guess that's all that's to say, is that there are certain forces that are stronger than the President of the United States, and the economic kind of reasons for continuing with the energy transition are a big part of that.
Thanks, Simon. Camilla, we've had a question come in from Nicholas Curtis around the sort of Article 6 component of the Paris Agreement around carbon markets. Nicholas is asking, how will Trump's election impact on the voluntary and compliance carbon markets, such as CORSIA for sort of aviation and the wider Article 6? Do you have any sense of, obviously that's a key part of the Paris Agreement dynamic, arguably. So what impact could or could not that have on, in terms of the Trump win on this?
I'm afraid I'm not in the detail of the carbon market negotiation, so I don't think I can comment broadly, but I would reflect on the fact that we obviously, of course, have the EU CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, coming on stream in 2026, at the beginning of 26. And as a result of that, there is a bit of a scramble around the world to think about what carbon markets might mean for different economies. And so I don't think it's going away as a force, as a tool, as an understanding of how countries want to organize themselves for the transition and relate to others. But certainly it may end up disrupting the space. And I think the carbon market and the ETS is something that does also bind the European Union and China together, because they have similar, if different, approaches to that as well. So I'll leave it to others to answer the conversation on the Article 6 and more into the weeds, but that's just a reflection more broadly that I think that dynamic is not going away.
Does anyone else on the panel want to comment on that, or happy to move on to the next question? No? Okay. Oh, go on, Simon.
Yeah, just very briefly, what we saw in Dubai last year at COP28, that there was some disagreements between the EU and the US over the level of transparency and kind of rigidity of bilateral carbon trading under Article 6.2. And I guess Camilla's already mentioned the kind of well-drilled US negotiating team and their lawyers, and I would guess that they would they're not going to kind of let this drop. They're not going to say, guys, do whatever you want, we're going to be out next year. I'm sure that they will continue to hold the line on their position, on the expectation that a future administration would bring the US back into the Paris Agreement. That there's some optimism that they might finally sort out Article 6 this year at COP29, but I don't think that the Trump election materially necessarily makes it easier or more difficult.
Okay, thanks, Simon. We've got a question here from Adam Vaughan, who's environment editor at the Times newspaper here in the UK. He's asking, what are you expecting on NDCs being announced before February next year, given the US election outcome? Are you expecting any countries other than the UK and the Troika to submit 2035 NDCs by that deadline? And when will China likely act with an NDC? Maybe, Shuo, you want to go first on that?
Sure. Let me just very briefly say that for quite a few months, the Chinese Environmental Ministry has made their intention on NDC announcement timeline very clear. They have been saying they will announce their NDC in line with the requirement of the Paris Agreement. 2 days ago, at a routine pre-COP press conference, they said they will announce their NDC at an appropriate time in 2025. So let me just leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to speak to Adam's point about the NDCs, or question around whether the Trump victory will have an impact on the timings and even the contents of the NDCs?
Leo, if I may, I think countries have committed to actually publish their NDCs next year. So it's expected in the first quarter, but all countries have actually agreed to publish their next NDCs by next year. And I think this is an excellent opportunity for those countries who want to actually step up and shift, the dial on climate and, sort of isolate the US and Trump's administration, for them to come forward and associate themselves with, the already agreed climate agreement. And so if we want to actually help advance, climate mitigation in our current polarized politics, here's an opportunity. And so for the BRICS particularly, the opportunity is in the timing. If they can actually help propose, their NDCs and ensure those NDCs are science-based, mitigation commitments, they're science-based, adaptation actions that helps to actually build resilience in their countries, and also for those in a position to do so, to also include their climate finance commitment. What you will have is actually a shift in international climate politics, where the rest of the world is actually going to be moving forward, and the US getting isolated. And so while the US attempts to lower international climate action efforts, the rest of the world can actually seize this opportunity and move forward and deliver very ambitious mitigation, adaptation, and finance actions. The other thing for me to say about these NDCs, these are national plans. So it's in those countries' national interest for them to actually develop the plans. And I think there's an opportunity for us to differentiate between the politics with the US versus the national interests of the countries to actually develop and bring forward those NDCs in a timely manner. And so what we should be doing and expecting from the countries is for them to support a science and equity-based international climate regime where they put forward and communicate the NDCs in a timely manner, because that's the kind of pressure that I think will help force the US to reconsider on both their climate mitigation effort, but also their climate finance effort. And so the collision of the willing and the timeliness of the NDCs is, I think, the stick we have and that we can use against Trump's administration.
Perhaps I'll just add to that a little bit. I mean, I really agree that it's about national interest. I do think that though it is a choice, because there are many countries who have sophisticated national climate plans of how they're going to make the most of them in their economy, but they don't necessarily feel compelled to put that into the international sphere. There are others who, quite frankly, have the opposite. They have very ambitious visions, but they don't know how to deliver them. So I think it's going to be an interesting tell. I think the fact that the Troika is coming out early is going to really set the tone. So you've got Brazil, a country that's going to have a huge opportunity to shape this international climate discussion, especially with an absent US. Absolutely, you have the dominance of China, but I think Brazil is a really interesting country in terms of how it speaks to so many different kind of constituencies itself. You've got the UAE, they're a country that have diversified away from oil and gas for the good of their country, to be modern, to be innovative. Not to say that they're not continuing to rely on oil and gas while they can, but nonetheless, they see the kind of aspirational potential of that. And then you've Azerbaijan as well, also traditionally, although much less so now, an oil and gas nation. And then alongside that, if you've got the UK, you've got an advanced economy coming forward. So that covers a lot of the bases of what we could see in terms of the dynamism around this conversation. And they have a huge opportunity to fill the vacuum. So if they step up and fill it, then they can create a sort of a value on that NDC process, which does reflect those interests, which is less about kind of the nice to have around, okay, we'll do something because it looks nice. It's, this is what we're doing with our markets. This is what we're doing with our investments. This is the direction of our country. Be with us if you want to be with us. And that will open up a very different kind of conversation, as opposed to what we've had before, which is much more kind of bottom up and science led, which needs to be there and needs to be the guardrail to taking these decisions. Absolutely. But also now we're in a different space. We're trying to shape markets. We're not just trying to follow science to the letter.
Thanks, Camilla. We've had a question from Ethan Stackpole, basically saying, Ethan's hearing lots of hopeful comments from the panel about that Trump, impact might not be as grave as some might fear. But if you look at the amount of global leaders who've just pulled out of COP29 appearing there at the World Leaders Day at the beginning, Xi and Biden won't be there anyway, but you've got von der Leyen, you've got Schultz yesterday or today pulling out, Macron, Trudeau, etc., etc. Maybe back to Camilla quickly. Do you, given your experience of helping to coordinate and bring together the COP26 summit in Glasgow, what's your honest sense of this kind of roll call of leaders kind of pulling out slightly at the last minute from actually appearing at COP29 in Baku?
So the roll call was always smaller. Just because there's less shape of a sort of leaders shape activity and set of actions to do for this COP. It's much more focused on the granularity of the negotiations. There is an advantage in leaders going, because if a leader goes, that means the leader's office and the corresponding offices across government are preparing them, and they are saying, focus, Prime Minister, President, on this topic. And with very busy agendas, that can be an incredibly helpful forcing mechanism for getting some clarity on different pieces. So it is helpful to have leaders there, but I also never had a high expectation of them going. I mean, I would hesitate to say that the Schultz pulling out is just related to the US election. I mean, they've had their own political severe turbulence in replacing their finance minister, although that's also a really interesting dynamic, because they want to replace the finance minister because they want to open up a conversation about investment that looks very different to how Germany has invested previously. And part of that is for modern infrastructure, and that is all about transition. So that's a very different nature of conversation that we're having, but that is actually where climate action and the transition is happening. So yes, I think, it's good that leaders come together and focus on this topic, but does it surprise me for this particular COP? Not really. Macron also has his own political turbulence to be managing. And this is the world we live in. We live in a lot of turbulence, a lot of different dynamics going on, and we have to navigate them the best we can. I'm not for a second sugarcoating this. It's going to be harder because we don't have a dynamic and pushy and confident US helping us on climate action. But nonetheless, there are a whole set of other equities which are going to shape this conversation. And I think the question being made about, Musk's role, what does that mean for EVs and solar? Absolutely, that's exactly the kind of dynamic that is now at play that wasn't there the last time Trump was elected. We have those interests, those equities of people who are going after this, and they don't just look like someone like me who cares about climate change and has been working on this a long time.
Thanks, Camilla. Simon, we've had a question about a few questions along these lines. This one's from Pallavi Sethi, who's asking, how will Trump's win influence the spread of climate misinformation, both in the US and beyond? Obviously, both you and I, Simon, as journalists, for our Carbon Brief daily briefing email, we go through the world's media every morning to write a summary of the world's media. And there's been cycles of it, and there's different issues relating to the misinformation that spins out of climate change. But what's your sense? You do a lot of fact checking and things for Carbon Brief. What's your sense of how another stint of Trump, a vocal climate denier, skeptic, claims it's a hoax invented by the Chinese, etc., very notorious comments. And you've also got this now additional thing where you've got this very enabled Elon Musk dynamic where he owns Twitter, now called X. And anyone who's experienced that platform recently knows just how intense the misinformation, etc., is on there. What's your sense as the sort of journalistic view on this, looking at this new kind of information ecosystem that we're now going to be operating in with Trump in the White House?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent, we're already in a different world today compared to, 6 or 12 months ago, or, winding back to, let's say, the run up to COP26 in Glasgow. I think in the UK, but more broadly internationally, that there was a much more positive kind of media ecosystem, if you like, around climate action. And then obviously the global energy crisis came along. We've had all sorts of geopolitics, if I could put it up in a word, since that point. And we've seen much greater volume and extent of people pushing back on climate action because of perceived costs and so on. I mean, I guess, and so, climate misinformation never went away. I guess, just purely from a very sort of selfish kind of Carbon Brief point of view, I would fully expect that we will have to do more fact checking than we would have had to do if Trump hadn't won the election. There was a certain extent to which, and while he was out of office, Trump said a whole lot of stuff. In his first term, every single thing that Trump tweeted used to be headline news. And then there was this 4-year period where that was no longer the case. He's going to be the president again, and that means all of the whatever stuff he says about climate, no matter how crazy it is, that is going to be that's going to be in headlines, that's going to be amplified and reflected in the media. And so, unfortunately, I think for the likes of Carbon Brief, we are going to have a bit more of a job on our hands in terms of responding to that.
Thanks, Simon. There's a question here for Shuo. It's from Karen Tiao, and it says, China's just announced its much anticipated fiscal stimulus. Do you think it factored into this a Trump win alongside its climate goals?
Well, sure. I'm sure that decision was made uninformed by the U.S. election outcome. Look, but I think the climate aspect of this is, whether the new stimulus package will propel a new round of, heavy emitting industries. My sense is that is not going to happen. The Chinese economy is in a very different place compared to 10 years ago. If you look at some of the most recent emission trend, which Carbon Brief has documented very clearly, the heavy industries are still, stabilizing. There's not much new and significant emission growth points. So I don't expect that this new round of stimulus will kind of trigger another round of a big emission surge. And then the question is really, are we seeing now a period of stabilization of China's emissions and potentially a peak of China's emissions? And if that's to happen, and also in light of the preparatory process for China's NDC is 2035 climate targets, what would that mean to China's future climate ambition? And we're trying to recognize that it is getting very close to its emissions peak. Actually, quite a few years earlier than what it has committed to. And whether the Beijing policymakers are willing to register that early achievement in their future climate targets. I think those are important questions to keep an eye on.
Thank you. Mohamed, we've had a question from Julie McCarthy, we've talked a bit obviously about climate finance, but this is quite a specific question. Can we also hear your thoughts on the impacts of the multilateral development bank financing for climate and nature? We've obviously just had COP16 in Colombia. Given the US is a key contributor to the International Development Bank, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, etc., what's your sense on the sort of downstream impact on that in terms of these multilateral development banks with Trump in the White House?
It will be challenging, but the point is those are multilateral development banks, and they need to deliver. And these are banks that have actually been set up when majority of our countries, including the whole of Africa, was actually still under colonization. And so we're talking about developing countries being asked to contribute to solve a problem we didn't create in the first place, without the commensurate support being provided to enable and facilitate these countries to contribute. And so climate finance, I think, and generally development finance that is climate compatible needs to be delivered if we're going to be able to actually tackle climate change in a way that holds warming to within safe levels. We cannot afford for climate cooperation to be affected because of Trump. And this is where I think the opportunity of other countries working together in their national self-interest to help sustain the much needed actions is required. With the last Trump administration, countries were able to carry on working together and collaborating on many issues and ensuring the important agenda around the reforms of the multilateral finance architecture being sustained up to now was actually possible because of that dynamic. I think that needs to be continued. What I see here is a case where the US is going to be left to stand on its own and left behind with the rest of the world, applying common sense across different issues, including development finance, and attempting to actually do what is right for the world. And so I think that is what we're already starting to observe. China, Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America, each of these countries are choosing to step forward, and the US is the one that is actually choosing to retreat from the world stage and failing to actually contribute what is expected of it. And so the story is actually going to be one where because of Trump, US will sabotage itself and be left behind, while the rest of the world will continue working together in the country's self-interest and delivering the kind of multilateral response that the world so desperately needs. I don't think we can afford for climate cooperation, development cooperation, to go into a deep freeze because we have Trump in the White House. I don't think that is going to happen. What will certainly be affected is the extent of the level of ambition, but the effort of the rest of the world to actually do what is expected of it is going to grow, in my view. And as a result of that, I think there's going to be shift with decarbonization being led by other countries rather than the US, which effectively means, as a result of Trump's decision to hold back the US, other countries will step up and lead. China is doing, part of Europe will do, India is doing, a majority of the BRIC countries are doing. The continent that I come from, Africa, that has majority of its population without energy now, may elect to actually develop on the back of renewables. The technology is currently it's coming from China rather than from Europe or from the US, which basically means the geostrategic cooperation between Africa and other global majority with China and the BRICS is going to be different. And that shift in the politics is largely going to disadvantage the US if the US chooses to retreat, as we're seeing now.
Okay, thanks, Mohamed. We're pretty much up for time. There's been so many brilliant questions. Thanks everyone for submitting them. I've probably got time for one quick one, and then maybe just do some last final sort of round of comments. I'm sure we can squeeze another sort of 5 minutes if everyone's okay with that. It's come from Amy Cortez. It was directed at Mohamed, but I think it also, obviously, I'd love to hear Shuo's response to this as well. It's just saying, will there be pressure on China now to join the group of wealthy, historic emitting nations that are expected to pay for climate finance? That's obviously long been a discussion, I guess, and I would expect that to be aired with or without Trump coming into the White House, certainly at COP29. Maybe if I can ask you, Shuo, to speak to that particular question that's coming from Amy.
Sure. I mean, just from a very analytical point of view, the fact that the US is now out or will soon be out means we will have one less donor. That also means if you are some of the other transitional donor countries, you want others and more people to join. So I don't necessarily think the fact that Trump has won the US election will make deal making in Baku, in particular, the contributor-based issue easier. In fact, it will complicate the situation. But again, whether all sides can find a solution, bearing in mind that they do need to demonstrate we're sent a larger point, which is the climate system, multilateral climate system, is still very resilient. If they can bear that in mind, I hope they will be able to find a deal that is still with good quality.
Okay, thank you. So let's just quickly go around for 20, 30 seconds of just reaction. Now we've had 2, 3, 4 days to soak in the news of Donald Trump's win. Maybe Camilla, just as a sort of final thought, how would you sort of leave us all as we all kind of exit this webinar? Give us something to think about.
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's going to be bumpy. I think it's going to be turbulent. I still think it's going to head in the same direction. And I think we've got a lot of different interests that will come into play. And the nature of climate leadership could end up looking very different by the end of his term. That was happening anyway, but I think this accelerates it further. It's, someone used the phrase earlier, Musk's vested interests. And normally we talk about vested interests when it comes to fossil fuels, but no, we have vested interests that are clean now, and that is going to dominate this discussion and this debate.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Camilla. Mohamed, any final sort of thoughts?
Sure. I think we have an opportunity to lead the world differently. And that can only happen if we have a just and equitable transition. That requires strategic repositioning of the world, given Trump's administration. And if that is going to happen now, I think it has to be led by the global majority. These countries are home to the majority of the world population. They're the ones who are suffering first and worst some of the impacts of climate change. And the opportunity to actually form what I would call South-South collaboration and then South-North collaboration, but terms that are actually right for the planet, led by our collective interest, is now. So it's bad that we're forced by Trump's election, but this is also an opportunity that if we seize it will deliver us in a time of a crisis.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Mohamed. And Shuo, what about you? Any final thoughts?
Sure, just very quickly, pay attention to, of course, news from COP29, including news written by Carbon Brief in particular, actually. See those as an early indication on how the rest of the world plans to move on, but pay more attention to the real economy news from now on, the green economic race, because I think, again, that will drive global climate action from now on, more so than the politics.
Okay, brilliant. And we appreciate your plug for Carbon Brief content. Maybe Simon, on that point, you can just remind everyone on the call as you're heading off to, as everyone on this call, well, I'm not, but everyone else on the call is heading off to Baku very shortly, I think, or either there. Can you give us a sense of some of the Carbon Brief content we've already published, which hopefully should be of use to everyone on this webinar, and what might be coming?
Yeah, thanks, Leo. Just very, very quickly on the, coming back to some of the earlier points. One of the things I've seen, which I think is really interesting, is just when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in the US, there was a lot of conversation about how it was kind of sucking all of the air out of the green investment in Europe, and how was Europe going to respond? How was the UK going to respond to attract some of that investment in clean energy manufacturing and so on? If the US is indeed pulling back from that, then that is also an opportunity for some of that investment that maybe was being sucked away to the US to actually come back to Europe. So I think that's an interesting point. Just in terms of Carbon Brief's coverage over the next fortnight, I'm flying out on Sunday with a few colleagues. There's going to be 4 of us there, and both weeks of the summit. And we've already published a summary of kind of who wants what, the different country positions on all of the key issues, from the new climate finance goal through to Article 6 carbon markets. We've got a very whizzy, amazing text tracker that Werner's magicked up with some data science, and it automatically updates as new draft texts are published. So if you're into watching the negotiations, you should definitely bookmark that one. And there's too many other things to talk about, really. There's a great summary explainer of the new climate finance goal put together by our colleague Josh. And then, of course, we'll be looking forward to publishing our traditional summary of the whole summit at the end of the 2 weeks, hopefully within a day or so of the gavel coming down.
Okay. So, thank you so much to you all. Really, really appreciate your time at this very, very intense week with lots of things going on. COP16, Trump win, COP29, very hectic week. So wish you all the best. And obviously, thanks. I think we've had more than 1,000 people on this call, which is absolutely incredible. And thank you so much for all the questions. And we couldn't get through them all. There will be a recording put on our website shortly of this, and it's been live streamed on YouTube as well. But just want to say many, many thanks to everyone, including obviously the panelists, but everyone who's joined today. And yeah, goodbye.